It all started in 1984. No relation. Some kids saw their parents working in high tech and thought, ooh, that's cool. Some went to see War Games. The movie scared Reagan into fearing hackers. Just think of what it could do to a bunch of teenagers. No matter the inspiration, they ended up sitting in front of a computer with their heads full of ideas. Beat up Apple IIs at home, landline connections, and bulletin boards. In theory, those were the ancestors of modern social media and forums, but really they were closer to clay tablets than Instagram or TikTok. Bulletin boards weren't hosted on servers. They were basically text files on somebody's computer. To read them, one had to reach out to that computer through a telephone line, call it, and then stay on the call long enough for the file to be downloaded. It's fine if the host computer is in your area code, at least as long as the parents are cool with you occupying the phone line for hours on end. But what if the host is in another state, all the way across the continent? That's a long-distance phone call, up to $1 a minute in 80s money. Even the most radical parents would lose their cool after seeing hundreds of dollars on their phone bill. Knowing how to hack a phone company was pretty much a requirement for reading the best bulletin boards. That's what Kevin and Brandon did. The boards were their life. On them, they found everything a nerd in the 80s would need. Discussions about computers, heavy metal, Star Wars, and anarchism. Discussions with other nerds. The boys lived in adjacent towns and loved to hang out together, but bulletin boards allowed them to hang out with even more nerds, and that was something. In 1985, Kevin scraped together $715 to buy a hard drive and set up his own bulletin board, so he could host his very own lovingly written parody of the anarchists' cookbook there. Brandon's older brother ran a bulletin board too, but Brandon had his own shtick. He knew how to use a blue box, an early hacking device to trick the phone lines into making a free call. Kevin and Brandon were just like thousands of other kids on the eve of the internet, but they really wanted to be something more, like a crew, a cool gang thing, and the only way to do that was to come up with a name. One of their favorite hangout spots was a creepy abandoned slaughterhouse nearby, a very spooky place. That's when it hit Kevin. Cult of the Dead Cow. Here's what happened next. Kevin became Grand Master Rat. His first handle was Swamp Rat because he loved swamps. Then Swamp Rat in German because that's edgy. Swamp got dropped and he became Grandmaster Rat. Brandon loved Sex Pistols, so he called himself Sid Vicious. He never came up with a cooler handle because in a short time he left the cult. But Bill joined. Frankenjibe. The cult part was right up his alley. He was the perfect age to rebel against his deeply religious family and come up with the cult's foundational text, the Book of Cow. And the cow grazed in the meadows and green pastures where the grasses still bowed beneath the dew of infinity. Cow was one with Roach and graced existence with the unspeakable. Yet Roach grew angry, for the bovine one, in his compassion, endowed to the earth that which it was unholy to know. Imagine you're a teenage outcast in 80s Texas and you see this on a random bulletin board. Scary cult stuff in between talks of hacking, computers, and rebellion. Of course, you're going to eat that up. And so more people joined. The cult grew. Talk of computers became more prevalent, but Cult of the Dead Cow was still not really about that. Maybe some members thought of themselves as badass hackers, but they were just a bunch of teenagers from Texas exchanging edgy messages on a bulletin board. They all did phreaking, primitive hacking of telephone networks to get free calls. Not that big of an achievement. They shared cracked software, but who didn't at the time? They doxed a local neo-Nazi once, but that was the extent of their activism. They were primarily a social club and an art project. Underground music, ASCII drawings, and text files with the edgiest writing their teenage brains were able to comprehend. But those text files were getting traction. In them, some letters got substituted by numbers for the first time. That's how the cult invented Elite. Even after computers improved and downloading actual pictures became possible, the group stuck with their ASCII because it provided a recognizable look. Couple that with pseudo-occultism, deliberately obscure lore, and the members getting assigned increasingly ridiculous titles, And you get something very important, a whole aesthetic that, through the coming decades, would forever get associated with everything hacking related. Cult of the Dead Cow invented it by masquerading as a hacker group, but being a creative outlet for some very talented people. They did perform some very primitive cyber attacks, though. Even Brandon, the original and short-time member of the cult, would occasionally go dumpster diving behind local offices in search of documents. The goal was to use the information to hack the company. Discarded sheets of paper could contain clues as to the systems the company used, maybe even entire passwords. Early hackers used this technique a lot, out of genuine curiosity or in an attempt to one-up each other. Maybe target a company that has extra predatory billing practices. But the idea itself, to comb through trash in search of valuable data, hasn't disappeared. It was adapted by data brokers, and the trash they're going after is digital. Old social media accounts you had but forgotten, websites that required registering for absolutely no reason, whatever scraps of data you left on the internet. Thankfully, these days there are services that specialize in cleaning up things like these, like this video's sponsor, Incogni. Say you signed up for this newsletter one day. You didn't leave any personal details, but the data brokers now know you're interested in this topic. And by gosh, they'll use this information to bombard you with ads. Or maybe they got your license plate from some data leak, or your social security number. Incogni looks for all that information and uses legal means to remove it from the data broker's databases. Its algorithm does that automatically, but it can also custom remove stuff on your request. Just send them a link to your exposed personal info, and their agents will try and take care of it. It even shows you the progress of how that's going on, the brokers that already complied, and the ones that are still dragging their feet. We're happy Incogni agreed to sponsor this video, because their service is all about putting an end to the practice that began with well-meaning hackers and is now misused by evil corporations. So if you're interested in giving Incogni a shot, use code ROLLBACK with the link below and get 60% off their annual plan. Incogni.com/rollback. Alright, back to Cult of the Dead Cow. Through the 80s, the group was more of an art project, but then the 90s came, and things changed. In the next couple years, Cult of the Dead Cow became a runaway success. Early on, if you wanted to join the cult, you had to meet just 3 requirements. Be known to an existing member, don't be boring, don't be an asshole. So pretty much anybody could join and do anything they want. In the early 90s, Rat took some courses in media and advertising and understood that this gang he's organizing could actually become something more. He began curating the cult's output. The writing he distributed became better and better. Soon, having a full collection of the cult's text files became a point of pride for any bulletin board. That's when people that mattered began joining. Veteran freakers with a decade of experience in breaching networks, counterculture personalities, some real hackers. At the turn of the decade, Cult of the Dead Cow had firmly cemented itself as one of the hacker groups of the era, along with such names as Legion of Doom and Masters of Deception. It was no longer a niche for edgy teenagers to post their art on. It was a movement with its own branches and offshoots. For example, one of such offshoots was The Loft, a hangout space for a couple of freakers, which later evolved into a full-fledged hacker advocacy group, the first one in the world. Because by that point, the cult and its many subsidiaries were full of people who actually cared about hacking, but not for their own benefit. People like Omega and Mudge. They had their own brushes with the law, but mainly resorted to cyber attacks for political rather than financial reasons. The fact that the cult was a hacker-themed art project more than an actual cybercriminal organization was crucial to their goals. One of the people responsible for things taking this turn was the Deth Vegetable. He joined in 1990 and ended up being one of the most influential members, at least to the way Cult of the Dead Cow was perceived by the outsiders.
And what appealed to me was not just specific about CDC, and still today what keeps me involved is that certainly at the time, and to some extent now, the other hacker groups, the other, freak groups, et cetera, all took themselves way too seriously. Super seriously, didn't seem to have a sense of humor. And I've always had a problem with people and or entities that take themselves too seriously. I have this sort of pathological need to poke holes in it when I encounter somebody like that. And so that's sort of what CDC, part of the ethos has always been, not taking ourselves too seriously, like doing serious things, but not taking ourselves too seriously. I know that there was a quote from Bruce Sterling, who wrote the Hacker Crackdown, referring to Cult of the Dead Cow. At one point, he referred to us as the smartest kids on the short bus to school, which he might have meant as insulting, but I thought was hilarious. But then he also referred to us as the termites in the foundation of the status quo, and I was like, and that is a great line.
This reputation was earned, in part, thanks to the cult's many appearances in the media. TV loved them, and they loved the TV back, but in their own special way.
I ended up getting being on a TV show called Dateline NBC, being interviewed for that, and then once you're interviewed for one thing, then the media has your number, basically, literally. I mean, your number, your email address. And so I sort of became the point of contact, and Minister of Propaganda was kind of like the joke title that we came up with. I coined a phrase which was a global domination through media saturation. And then there were, with the idea that like, look, if you want to change the world, you need to get people to listen to you. Like you need to be visible to people. And so this is a way to do that. And that can be in ways that are real. It could be ways that are essentially disinformation. One of the things that I personally took joy in was there was a lot of lack of understanding of who computer hackers were, what they were, what their motives were, what they were capable of, both in the media, in the public at large, but also law enforcement. And so some of what we talked about at the time was a way of poking fun at that by making claims that were completely outrageous.
In this, the cult used a particular technique called culture jamming. It came from the counterculture groups of the 70s and essentially boiled down to forcing the media to subvert itself. Anything from defacing public ads to staging elaborate hoaxes. That's culture jamming. A hacker appearing on TV only to play a parody of himself is a particularly poignant example of that, and CDC members did it with gusto. They all had their characters and used them in front of the cameras, often making fun of clueless reporters and producers, and almost single-handedly created the image of the 90s hacker we know today. And that's when we finally come back to the performance that would define this type of activity. Culture jamming at its finest, the Hong Kong Blondes. It was a brainchild of Oxblood Ruffin. He was a Canadian, well-traveled, with a background of working in the United Nations. The cult's all-out counterculture assault on the establishment fascinated him.
Basically, when the web got started in the early search engine days, I just became very interested in what was happening in the hacking scene and trying to discover what was going on. So I eventually kept getting pointed to Cult of the Dead Cow. At the time, it was primarily known for publishing text files. Some of them were hilarious, some were outrageous. But I always had a feeling there was a little more going on with Cult of the Dead Cow than just cracking jokes. I thought they were, on the top, very frivolous and kind of funny, but they had a kind of depth to them that most other groups didn't, at least as far as I could see. So I just became very interested in them and started corresponding with the Deth Vegetable. Nobody can get rid of their old hacker names. But yeah, I just started corresponding with him out of the blue. We were in touch for about a year, and then I got an email saying I was in Cult of the Dead Cow, which I actually thought was a joke at first.
Of course, after joining the cult, Oxblood wanted to contribute. He wasn't a hacker though, so putting on shades and appearing on TV wouldn't cut it. His stunt had to be bigger, even international in its scope, perhaps.
I think because I was at the UN and China is such a huge player there, I was reading a lot about the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese history. So I was quite, definitely not a supporter, of the government, but just definitely intrigued about how the country was changing. And at that point, I thought, oh, here's an opportunity maybe for some kind of genuine reform, but it was just completely stamped out.
The Tiananmen Square massacre was broadcasted on TV live. Millions of people saw the students voicing their demands, appealing for a change. They saw the Chinese troops moving in and the violence that ensued. And then, hundreds of bodies littering the streets of Beijing.
I had a colleague in the Chinese mission. We were taking a language class together. And so this is how I came to meet her. And she was very interesting, very educated, very loyal, member of the Communist Party. But I remember seeing her around that time, and just the look on her face was like this horror, like what is going on? But you could tell, like in the entire building, nobody could quite believe what was going on. And just like all of these students and young people being killed, it was like the only thing I can compare it to, maybe, and it's not quite the same, but the Kent State shootings back in the 60s, when students were shot by I think it was National Guard.
The Kent State shootings were pivotal in a growing resistance against America's war in Vietnam. The Tiananmen Square massacre had a complete opposite influence on China's policies. It was the start of a total crackdown on civil liberties. Inside the country, the event itself was simply erased. Just like in the memes, saying even a word about hundreds of protesters massacred in the middle of Beijing was strictly disallowed. Anything that could paint the party in a bad light was simply banned. Many of the survivors of the massacre fled west, bringing with them horror stories about the censorship happening in China. But as the years passed, this had less and less influence on the way the West treated China. Pragmatism prevailed. China was an economy on the rise, an important manufacturing hub, and a valuable trade partner.
It was under Clinton, I believe in 1997, that the most favored nation trading status was granted to China again, which meant that, okay, there's going to be economic activity, but it was also an open door for Western tech firms, particularly American firms, to start doing business in China. So they're starting to build, the so-called Chinese firewall, providing all of the technology to do that. And that really got under my skin. And so there was a kind of momentum gathering, at least in my own mind, between what CDC could do and how it was being perceived from the outside. So CDC was primarily a pranking publishing group, media hoaxes, all this kind of stuff. But it had a huge platform that I was very much aware of. There were a number of things going on where I thought momentum was building, where there might be an inflection point where the CDC could maybe start thinking about another direction. So I began crafting a narrative around a group of Chinese dissidents who also happened to be hackers. Half of that was true, the other half was made up. I was just trying to craft a narrative that would grab people's attention.
Oxblood ran his narrative through his pals at the cult, Deth Vegetable, Omega, some other members. They kind of liked it. It had all the right ingredients: sleek, flashy, mysterious, with the right cause at the core of it. And so, the collective gave it a go.
He had sort of originally set this up like, oh, I know this guy. This is a thing that's real. He never explicitly told us that it wasn't real. I think there was an aspect on our side of choosing to suspend disbelief to some degree, or at least when it came with our press releases and the way we express this to the outside world, because we could see that it was an attempt to approach a real problem, government-funded censorship in an authoritarian and restrictive autocracy, in this case, the People's Republic of China.
There was a problem, though. The operation the cult was preparing to pull off didn't have a precedent before. It was supposed to be a hoax, but not a hoax in the way hoaxes have previously been done. And it was a hacking operation, but not in the way hacks are usually performed. It was a case of activism, but not in the usual case of activism. A new term had to be invented for it.
CDC would usually put out files in batches, so maybe 10 files at a time. And so Omega, who's a member of CDC, longstanding member, and quite a security expert in his own right, was doing a lot of editing of these files, and he was working with Reed Fleming on something that he was publishing at the time. So he had you would say like an advanced look, before this went out the door. And as a result of reading that file, I think, he became very interested in the idea of hacking and activism and how they might work together, and ended up creating that portmanteau of, hacktivism.
Hacktivism, just like elite. It stands as one of the greatest inventions of the cult of the dead cow. But unlike elite, hacktivism was originally invented to describe one particular thing, the operation known as the Hong Kong Blondes. August 10, 1997, the last day of the Beyond Hope conference. With attendance of over 2,000, it was probably the largest gathering of hackers in history at that point. Members of the cult of the dead cow were all over it. They even had a special panel all to themselves.
So we're going to start out. I'm going to have Oxblood tell you a little bit about what we've been working on. This is something that's been really hush-hush for reasons that will soon become clear. And I want to note that we really can't say that much about it. We're going to talk about it a little bit, but it's really something that you'll find out.
Lives are at stake.
What?
Lives are at stake.
Lives are at stake, literally.
The cult had a special announcement, one carefully crafted by Oxblood right before the conference, and aimed at both hackers in the audience and the media that swarmed it.
Recently, the Cult of the Dead Cow has been associated with a group of Chinese democratic advocates and computer scientists, primarily living and working in the People's Republic of China. There are also 3 members living in North America who are very active in fundraising and in technical support. This group is called the Hong Kong Blondes, but we did wish to announce that we have in fact formed the strategic alliance with the Hong Kong Blondes. We will be working with them in future, and we're very honored to do so.
The announcement also included a picturesque account of the difficulties hackers in China are facing, and the stab at the usual enemy of hackers, authoritarian governments. A dying breed of behemoths doing everything they can to crack down on the freedom the digital world offers. At the time, the view at this newly born internet and computer networking in general was inconceivably optimistic. There were hacker manifestos proclaiming the sovereignty of the web and denouncing all things offline. This new virtual world was not just an extension of the old one. It was a whole new dimension where people rejected by society could build a better one. Governments and corporations, of course, sought to interfere with that, but they were just a relic of a bygone era. Censorship, misinformation, nonsensical laws, and sporadic arrests were an attempt to cling to old habits that were bound to die off sooner or later. Did we mention that early hackers' views were very optimistic? Still, no matter how old-fashioned and ineffective, the government still posed danger. A danger that could easily cost a hacker their life.
The worst thing that's going to happen if you take a caller is you'll probably go to a federal penitentiary for a few years. The worst thing that's going to happen to you in PRC if you're picked up for one of these intrusions is you'll take a bit of a beating, and then you'll take a bullet in the back of your head. There's no soft treatment for anybody involved in what they would see as treason.
As Oxblood explained, the hacking community was one community. Hackers in the US were the same team as hackers in China. That's why all hackers had to support each other. That's why the struggle of oppressed hackers in China was something their peers in the US had to care about. While the members of the Blondes were supposed to be veteran freedom fighters, the group as a whole was brand new, only created in September 1996. Thus, as an older sibling in the alliance, the cult was offering their support and counseling. It advised the Blondes on how to organize protests and resistance through the internet. What that actually meant was left intentionally vague. Same with the announcement of the Blondes in the cult's next text file. It cemented the alliance and encouraged other hackers to support these Chinese activists, and promised that from now on, the public is going to hear about the Blondes a lot. That did not immediately happen. The whole show at the conference and the dramatic announcement was designed to spark the curiosity of the community and create a mystery around this enigmatic group. But hackers, one of the main recipients of the message, barely cared.
What or who are the Hong Kong dolls?
The Hong Kong...
The New York dolls? What?
Or the Hong Kong blondes, or whatever you call it.
There was quite a bit of curiosity from the media, though. One journalist even reached out directly to Oxblood and asked for a contact with the leader of the Blondes. A contact the cult wasn't really able to provide, of course, but it showed that the interest in this mythical leader existed, and Oxblood was going to play right into that. In July 1998, the cult published a new text file. It was an interview that Oxblood supposedly took from Blondie Wong, the leader of the Hong Kong Blondes. And, to be quite frank, it was quite an impressive interview. "What's up with you and those Prada loafers? Have you been reading wallpaper? Are you dating a model? Give it up, hacker man. Enough! Clothes aren't important. If that were true, you wouldn't wear D&G suits. Face it, you're one styling revolutionary. I own 2 suits. Everything else can be put into a suitcase, and that includes my computer and personal items. I own very little. You like to travel light. I have to travel light. You make it sound like someone's after you. You know who is after." It established the defining image of the Blondes, a group of continent-hopping, spy games-playing, underground revolutionaries. Blondie Wong himself was described as a smartly dressed anti-hero with a tragic past, an astrophysicist who had to leave China in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre. He fled to Canada, became a protege of a local businessman, and soon turned into a rich and sophisticated vigilante. Now he traveled the world with a giant bodyguard and spent his time evading Chinese spies, collaborating with the triads, and hacking Chinese satellite networks. A story straight out of a 90s thriller. But remember how the hackers were portrayed in the media at the time? In this context, it was a believable story. Also, the decades saw a lot of Chinese expats scatter across the West. Some of them ended up being quite rich, some entangled themselves in criminal networks, and a lot of them harbored less than savory feelings toward the Chinese Communist Party. It's not inconceivable to imagine that some of them would take up hacking as a way to get back at it.
Overall, it was a mix of sort of myth and fact. The mythical parts, I mean, that they had disabled, satellites and whatever, that was just something that people we knew had done. So I thought, okay, that's going to make them sound interesting. The other things, like particular elements of his life, some of those were true and others were true of different people that I knew. So a lot of it, you can say, is fabricated and made up as it was presented. I came up later with the term true disinformation. I mean, the facts were correct, but there was a lot of obfuscation in there because clearly, I wanted to protect Blondie's identity and the people that I knew who were involved with him.
Now, who was the blonde whose identity had to be protected? That's a question we'll have to return to later. But a much more important question is, what was the goal of inventing a whole new hacker group and announcing it to the world? Well, that was not difficult to figure out. Besides describing Blondie Wong as a cross between Bruce Wayne and Elliot Alderson, the interview included a thinly veiled call to action for hackers of Chinese descent to attack any company that does business with China. So, on the surface, the messaging was clear. If any people like the fictional blonde existed, Oxblood sought to mobilize them, attract them to the cause of the Blondes. But there were wider-reaching goals too.
Well, there were 2 things really that I was shooting for. One was simply to raise the issue of human rights in China. And the second was to think about what does it mean for the West and Western technology firms to be involved in helping to promote censorship and just making themselves available. The contradiction for me is that in the West and the United States in particular, the notion of the First Amendment, of free speech, of access to information, and these are like the most fundamental rights in the United States, and I think generally in the West, this notion of speech and access to speech. So those were the issues that I was trying to raise.
At the time, the cult's communications singled out Microsoft as a firm particularly worthy of railing against. Like many tech giants, it heavily invested in China, choosing to ignore the repressions that were rampant in the country. The choice of Microsoft wasn't accidental. While preparing to release the Blondes, Cult of the Dead Cow also had certain plans regarding Microsoft. The plans that would, in due course, become the cult's biggest contribution to the hacking world. The interview with Blondie Wong was released on July 15, 1998.
I chose the moment like a week before, sort of building up to DEF CON when Back Orifice was released. That's when I decided to publish the story because one story could piggyback the other. It would make Back Orifice possibly seem a little more interesting, and it would make people think, oh, this hacker group is working with these human rights people. So I didn't really know going in how it would play out, but that I sort of rolled the dice on that date and thought, okay, maybe something will happen.
Okay, to better explain that, we have to do a little sidetrack and talk about the Back Orifice. In the mid-90s, Microsoft was well on its way to become the #1 tech monopoly of the digital world. Compromises with human rights weren't the only ones made at the time. Its security wasn't great either, and that was the primary concern for the cult. That's why it concocted the Back Orifice. It was a Windows backdoor carefully engineered by Žadeikis, a newly anointed member of the group. He was a skilled hacker, and as more and more versions of Windows were being released through the 90s, his hate of the company grew. Because Windows, basically, had no security. No pre-installed antivirus, no firewall, nothing. A script kiddie could have hacked it. And many script kiddies did, but Microsoft didn't care. Reports about security flaws, many of them reported by the members of the cult themselves, were just ignored. Microsoft had to be taught a lesson. The DEF CON Hacker Conference was becoming big, and the Cult of the Dead Cow reserved a major spot there. They invited the media, pre-arranged interviews, and choreographed the biggest show the hacking world has ever seen. Back Orifice was officially announced, a foolproof hacking tool. Anyone could install it and hack any computer connected to the internet with just a few clicks. It didn't just use a security vulnerability Microsoft left in their program. It exploited the insecure architecture of the latest Windows versions, and patching it out was basically impossible. And now, thanks to all the song and dance the cult did, everybody knew about that flaw. The gang even distributed CDs with Back Orifice to the audience. It was a media scandal, and Microsoft could no longer talk its way out of that. The cult proved that it means business. It engineered the biggest hacking scandal of the year. Suddenly, everything else this group of loudmouth hackers did started to seem a lot more serious, including the story of Hong Kong blondes, just like Oxblood planned. Talk of the blondes was all over the media. In a matter of weeks, they entered the pantheon of the most dangerous hacker gangs, an elusive team of Chinese tech geniuses fighting for a revolution in a repressive regime. The articles talked of Chinese government websites being defaced and computer systems disrupted by this group. Their crowning achievement was incredibly impressive for the 90s, a takedown of a Chinese satellite communication network.
I was actually shocked at how quickly the story picked up. At the time, Wired Online was, the outlet that a lot of people who were spending a lot of time online would go to, particularly ahead of, various print versions of media. So after it landed in Wired Online, it seemed to go everywhere. The New York Times, just almost name a newspaper or an outlet, and it showed up in some form, one or the other.
What exact network was taken down, what exact systems were disrupted, and what websites were being defaced didn't really matter that much. Fact-checking these claims was nearly impossible, so if the members of the cult said something, it had to be trusted. After all, that's the guys who released the Back Orifice. And one thing the cult made sure was to put the word hacktivism into every article writing about the blondes. They weren't just hackers. They were hacktivists. They hacked for a cause. Media frenzy around Hong Kong blondes died down around 1999. For one, the group moved on to other projects. Promoting blondes was never a major concern for Cult of the Dead Cow as a whole. Rather, it was a personal project of Oxblood, with which the rest of the gang agreed.
CDC is not a monolith. We're a herd, not a monolith. We have different opinions.
Around that time, the cult issued an official press release saying that it ended its relationship with the blondes. Barely anyone cared. Although most of the hacking community never quite got what we were trying to do together, we were heartened by the kind of generous support that came from all the right people. The Blondes intend to continue their work in spite of the blundering oversight of some of the worst system administrators known to the international intelligence community. The cult considered the whole Blonde saga as a successful example of culture jamming. For a few years, the entire culture was jam-packed with the stories about the Blondes. It may have inspired some young hacktivists to rise up against authoritarian governments in China and elsewhere, but of course, that's impossible to confirm. We've been unable to find any mentions of Hong Kong Blondes in mainland Chinese press, so it's hard to say if the story penetrated into China. One of the cult's goals was to send Chinese police on a wild goose chase after an elusive hacker group that really didn't exist. We don't know if that happened or not.
As far as I know, nothing was mentioned publicly. The only reaction that I noticed was a number of press outlets in Hong Kong were saying, we think this is probably a hoax. We've never seen these people before. There's no record of them in Hong Kong, which I thought was kind of like amusing. Why would a journalist know about a hacker group? I just don't think they kind of understood how hacking worked and especially how younger hackers operate.
Blonde's biggest impact was in the Western press, where the group continued to resurface for years on end. Does this count as success? Maybe. Oxblood isn't convinced, though.
You know, it went out the door, it got a massive amount of coverage. But from my perspective, it didn't really get the coverage that I was aiming for. I was trying to get people interested in human rights in China. I was trying to make them aware of Western technology firms assisting with the censorship, developing the so-called Great Chinese Firewall. That to a certain extent happened, but reporters and journalists in general were much more interested in a group of sexy Chinese hackers. And so I think they kind of missed the point, but in another way, you could say that that was the beginning of hacktivism as we understand it.
That is actually true, and it's the biggest impact of the whole operation. Hacktivism, a term specifically invented in the lead-up to these events, became a common term. The methods of hacktivism used by the Hong Kong Blondes also became common. Here's what we mean. Contemporary hacktivism is not about what really happened. It's about what people think happened. Just try to remember how many times Anonymous, the quintessential hacktivist group, claimed to have hacked some large corporation. A claim comes almost each month. Some people freak out, and then the world moves on. Few ever fact-check these claims, and if they do, the attack rarely gets confirmed. But by then, the moving on part has already started, and it's time for a new, fresh claim. Anonymous itself nowadays is a bit like a Hong Kong Blonde situation. It doesn't really exist, but lots of people think it's real, and so claims of Anonymous attacking somebody have a real impact. Hacker groups standing for every conceivable goal routinely publish their claims specifically for the media to take and run them. The claim being true or the group actually existing doesn't really matter. Hacktivists play with perception, the exact method Cult of the Dead Cow invented with Hong Kong Blondes. And that's the legacy of this operation. It could be the end of the story too, but there's one more loose end we have to tie. In 2015, Oxblood published a lengthy write-up of his own experience with the Blondes hoax. It was the first time anyone involved with the cult admitted that the story was, to a large extent, fabricated, but it also detailed what parts of it had been true, like the character of Blondie Wong.
I initially met him at a booze can in Toronto. There was a place called the Matador, which was after-hours club. You would pay, I don't know, like $10 to get in, and you could drink all night. And I was just like sitting alone at the table. Blondie came up and asked if he could sit down, and I was a little surprised, but okay, sit down. We ended up talking. So, you know, that's originally how I met him. Oddly enough, I just assumed because he's a Chinese guy, he would be interested in Tiananmen Square. Turned out he was very interested. We just ended up staying in touch. We met maybe once or twice again, you know, after that, and then the rest of the time on IRC. So, and that's where most of the dialogue, particularly involving him, most of it just came from IRC chats that I snapped up.
Blonde may have been a rich expat with a sense of style and a bodyguard, but he wasn't a hacker.
There were a couple of people that he was working with who were computer science students, and they in fact were kind of doing things here and there. I would say like maybe definitely two of those guys were very technical. I also sexed them up a little bit, in the story just to create that hook. So they were technically competent, but their real agenda was getting, dissidents and people who were at risk out of China, and they did that through basically human trafficking gangs.
Oh, yeah, that's the part of the story that doesn't get discussed that often. The prototype of Blondie Wong was involved with some pretty shady people. He was a bit of a vigilante and a bit of an activist, but not in the way the media portrayed him. He was part of a network that involved criminal gangs helping Chinese dissidents escape persecution.
They weren't writing letters to Congress and getting governments involved. They were just coming up with a fee of, at the time, it was around $30,000 to pay to get people extracted from Hong Kong. And so from there, they would, go to different countries where these gangs were active, and they're active all over the world. It's not a big surprise to anybody. I just don't think that people were willing to make that connection.
By the way, this connection is how the name for Hong Kong blondes was created. As Wong once explained, in Hong Kong slang, blonde means gold. What Wong really needed to smuggle more dissidents out of danger was more gold. More Hong Kong blondes. Wouldn't that be a cool name for a hacker gang? We don't really know where the real Blondie is now. Maybe he knows that he unwittingly became an inspiration for the hacktivist movement. Maybe not. In any case, we found this story quite fascinating, and we hope you did too. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and see you in the next video.